It's a clash of titans. Alexander Grischuk versus the world champion Magnus Carlsen in a blistering blitz battle from the Tal Memorial. We jump into a Queen's Indian defense, a sophisticated opening promising a deep strategic fight. Standard opening moves here. White grabs the center and black develops, preparing to place that light-squared bishop on the long diagonal where it will be an absolute monster. Both players continue developing logically. White props up the queen side against black's pressure from the bishop on a6, while Carlsen gets ready to challenge the center with a pawn push to d5. The middle game maneuvering begins. Grischuk builds pressure on the d-file, completing his development. Carlsen, meanwhile, sends his knight out to h5, looking for active play on the king side. Grischuk decides it's time to break things open, pushing his pawn to e4. Carlsen responds by creating his own pressure, capturing on c4 and then advancing his b-pawn to challenge white's queen side. A flurry of pawn captures rips open the center of the board. The position is now incredibly tense and dynamic, a tactical minefield where a single slip could be fatal. And Grischuk recaptures on d5. A fantastic move, and in fact the only one that keeps a real advantage. The point is a deep tactical idea where a follow-up knight to e5 would win material by force. Carlsen immediately challenges that idea, jumping his own knight into e5. Grischuk doesn't hesitate, and the bishop snaps it off. But Magnus finds the brilliant response: queen takes on e5. This is the only move. Anything else and white's tactical threats would break through, but this precise recapture keeps the game in the balance. Knight takes c4. What a move from Grischuk. A brilliant, sound sacrifice that blows the position wide open. He gives up the knight temporarily to shatter black's pawn structure and will emerge from the complications a clean pawn ahead. The dust settles from the sacrifice. Black recaptures and Grischuk collects his winnings. He's now a pawn up and immediately begins improving his pieces, rerouting a knight to attack black's weakened queen side. But here, under pressure, Magnus slips. He plays his rook into a vulnerable square, missing a much more resilient defense. The stronger try was queen to b2, then after knight to c2, knight to g4, rook to c1, and knight to e5, keeping the balance. But in the game, Magnus plays rook to b2, and this allows Grischuk to build up a significant advantage, and Grischuk immediately pounces. His queen drops back to f1, forcing the black rook to move, and his knight lands on the powerful c4 square. But what a fantastic defensive find from Magnus. Queen to e7 is the only move that holds the position together. And here's the point. White plays queen to d3, but knight to d7 holds, and after pawn to a3, the rook can slide back to b8, and black is still fighting. The tension ratchets up. Grischuk maneuvers his queen, probing for a weakness, but Carlsen defends with precision, using his rooks to create counter-threats and keep white on his toes. Grischuk brings his last rook to the d-file, completing his mobilization. Carlsen prepares to challenge white's monster knight on c4. And here, Grischuk returns the favor with a slight inaccuracy, letting some of his advantage slip away. He missed a more powerful continuation. The best move was bishop to h3, and after knight to f6, bishop to f5, pawn to a5, and queen to d2, white maintains crushing pressure. Instead, in the game, he plays queen to e2, giving Magnus a chance to get back in it, and Carlsen seizes his chance. The knight hops to b6, and the rook suddenly snatches the pawn on a3. But in doing so, he exposes his king, and Grischuk's knight leaps to f5, launching a vicious attack. And this is the final decisive mistake. Queen to d8 looks natural, but it completely misses the crushing blow that's coming. The only way to survive was rook to a4, and after bishop to e4, pawn to g6, knight takes h6 with check, the king steps to g7, and black is hanging on by a thread. But back in the game, Carlsen plays queen to d8, and this is simply losing on the spot. Grischuk delivers the knockout blow. The queen swings to b2, a killer move that forces a series of exchanges that will leave white completely winning. Even in a lost position, what a find. Pawn takes f6 is the only move that doesn't lose even more material on the spot. A testament to Carlsen's defensive resources, but the position is hopeless, and Grischuk is absolutely clinical. Knight takes d6 is the most precise way to convert the win, removing a key defender. The idea is simple and brutal. After pawn to a5, the bishop just drops to f1, the pawn pushes to a4, and knight to e4 cements a winning position, up a full piece. Black's position is collapsing, and rook to d8 is another slip that only speeds up the end. A tougher defense was pawn to c4. After rook to c1, pawn to c3, knight to f5, and pawn to a5, black could put up more resistance. But after the move played, rook to d8, Grischuk's knight is about to land the final blow. And here comes the end. The white knight jumps to b7, and the d-pawn begins its unstoppable march to the queening square. Black's defenses are completely overwhelmed. A final desperate capture with the knight on d7, but it changes nothing. The game is over. Grischuk simply recaptures with the rook on d7, and the path is clear. Black tries one last trick, pushing the c-pawn, but it's a futile gesture. A slightly better try, though still losing, was rook to d3, rook takes, rook on d3 pawn, takes rook on d3, rook to d1 pawn to d2. But after the game's pawn to c3, White's knight delivers the final, crushing blow. The knight lands on d6, a devastating square. The rook swings over to c7, and Black has no moves left. It's all over. And in this completely hopeless position, Magnus Carlsen resigns. Grischuk takes the win after a brilliant tactical performance. Black saw that there was no defense to White's threats. Because of this unstoppable sequence, the rook would swing to b3, but the knight simply jumps to f5. The rook moves to b1, the other rook comes to f1, and after rook to b2, there is no stopping mate or catastrophic material loss.